The next session now is on the opening of the Liverpool Railway by David Gwynn. The moderator is Mani Venkatramanan. Manikandan Venkatramanan is a finance and risk management professional who has obtained his Chartered Financial Analyst CFA and Financial Risk Manager FRM Charter. He did his MS in Finance from the University of Pittsburgh. In addition, he is an alumnus of the Indian Institute of Management, Bengaluru. He is currently in the consulting industry, an avid rail fan, and an active and passionate member of the Rail Enthusiast Society. He is interested in reading about the past and the present of railroading, its operations and technology. He serves as a director of the UK-based World Alliance of Tourist Trains, Trams and Trains, where he represents India. He is also a member of the UK-based Advanced Steam Traction Trust. He connects and liaises with various railroad associations in the US. Above all, he is an active member of the Rail Enthusiast Society and one of the real planners of this seminar, the 2 day seminar today. Over to you, Mani.
Thank you so much, Manojji, once again for such a kind introduction. Uh, Before we begin introducing our august guest, our illustrious guest for today, I would like to share some experience. So I would like to call Mr. David Gwyn, I think it's called in Welsh, the son of the soil of Gwynedd in Wales. Uh, my connection with Dr. Gwyn seems to have been predestined because what had happened was 2 years ago, I quite by chance happened to purchase his book, The Coming of the Railway. And then I was very much hooked on into the topic of that book because the topic, what he had covered in that book was the history of the railway from 1750 to 1850. This is not something which is actually touched upon or known to people, and it's glossed over in all mainstream publications because most of the interesting stuff happens after 1850. So that was something which I found very interesting. And then what had happened by the twist of fate, right? The coincidence embossed in the Iron Road is that when I did my original research on the history, the history of early railways in Mysore state, my moderator happened to be Dr. Gwyn. So I think that was supposed to be one of the greatest coincidences in life. I'm very happy for that, the way it happened. So over to introducing him. He was born in Bangor in Gwynedd in Wales, and he's a graduate of the University of Cambridge. He works as a heritage consultant. He's an independent archaeologist, historian, and a conservationist in private practice, mostly in North Wales, but he also has global interests. He is an officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE, and also the Fellow of the Society of Antiquaries. He is serving various roles, very important roles in various heritage lines in Wales, like the Festiniog Railway and the Bala Lake Railway. He was the lead consultant on the successful bid for UNESCO World Heritage status for the slate landscape of Northwest Wales. His early childhood was spent in Bethesda in the 1960s, where it was a period of transition for the slate quarries and mines in Wales. And then he decided then that his aim was to chronicle the history of Wales and its people. So if you call it in Sanskrit, a real Bhumi Putra of Wales. So over to you, Dr. Gwyn. I'm looking forward to this presentation.
Good. I am unmuted. Can you all hear me?
Yes, sir. Good.
Good. Excellent. Thank you very much indeed, Mankanda, for a very flattering introduction indeed. And thank you once again for your fascinating paper last autumn at the Early Railways Conference in Darlington. thank you for the invitation to speak at this conference today as well. The story of the railway is nothing if not an international one. One of the interesting discoveries I made when I first became seriously interested in railway history was the connections between various different types of railway technology in all the countries of the world. And I've certainly very much enjoyed our formal connection on the Festiniog Railway with the railways of India. We are formally joined with them, and the world's largest civilian employer, I believe, is therefore associated with a 40-mile, 2-foot gauge long steam-worked railway in North Wales. The connection, however, does go back further than that, and can be traced to the 1870s, when some of the preliminary design work on the Darjeeling was, I believe, carried out in Porthmadog, the lower terminus of the Festiniog Railway. So Wales and India do have some surprising and interesting synergies. But I want to talk to you about another country altogether today, England. Now, England's not very far away from Wales, but it is a different country, even though it's part of the United Kingdom, as we are here still. And I would like to talk to you about the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And I'm now going to try and share the screen. And so far, I'm not meeting with any success at all. Here we go. And
If it doesn't work, I can do it for you as
Yeah,
well.
or I
yes,
can do it,
okay,
whichever.
let's do that. I don't want to
Yeah.
waste too much time. So if you care to do that, Manny, that would be great.
Okay, let me know if you can see my screen.
I can certainly see your screen. I hope everybody
Put
else
it in the
can.
presentation mode. Yeah, excellent.
There we go. Okay, can everybody see that
Yes, sir.
well enough? So, yes, the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. Now, last year, 2025, was the bicentenary of the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So there was an awful lot of media focus, television programs, public lectures on the Stockton and Darlington, effectively a colliery railway in the northeast of England. Absolutely true to say that that was a fundamental step forward in railway history. But because the media like a good story, I feel that its significance was just slightly overplayed. Um, Many people still think of the Stockton and Darlington as the first railway. Many people still think of it as the first steam railway, and of course it was nothing of the sort. Steam traction had been established over 20 years earlier at Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales. And by 1825, there were, I would say, a good 1,000 miles of railway track in the United Kingdom. So, although it did make a number of important improvements in the way that railways functioned, such as the combination of wrought iron track and locomotive traction, it seems to me that we should see it more importantly as part of a series of step changes that went on between the years immediately after the Battle of Waterloo and the early 1830s. And to my mind, one of the most fundamental was the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway in 1830. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. Now, we associate, if we go back one slide, that's the one. Of course, as railway people, we think steam locomotives. This is the most important thing. This is the technology which explains all others. If we move on one slide, there's a lovely illustration here. That's the one of Stephenson's rocket, a fundamental change in the way that steam locomotives were conceived, and essentially the start of the design path that was followed for as long as steam locomotives continued to be built. the rocket was innocent of cutoff. It had no superheaters or anything like that. Its 022 configuration was very soon changed. In fact, within a year of its construction and of having demonstrated at the trials in 1829 that steam traction was the optimal form of traction, it had become design expired and it had been relegated to ballast train duties. But undoubtedly, it was a game changer. What I'd like to suggest as well, and I speak here as somebody who has had to, if you like, revive railways or learn how that process takes place. Not like the Liverpool and Manchester build one from new, but I've learned, sometimes the hard way, the importance of public support and public face. Let's have a look at the next slide, and I'll try and explain to you what I mean. Now, the Liverpool and Manchester was conceived initially as a railway to move cotton. Its directors were rather surprised in the event that it proved to carry as many passengers as it did. But the original concept was to move cotton, raw cotton from India, from the USA, from Egypt to the docks at Liverpool, where wagons were hauled up through this tunnel, the first railway tunnel underneath the city, by stationary steam engines, where they were there taken by steam locomotive to Manchester for processing, and then they were returned to Liverpool and distributed all over the world. Is one of the extraordinary stories of the Industrial Revolution that the British seemed to manage to gain control of the cotton trade, and that cotton from India was taken thousands of miles for processing in Lancashire and then very often returned to India. And that's an interesting story and one directly relevant to the Indian experience, but we don't really have time to go in for it today. What I think this slide will make clear to you is that the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was not just ambitious in terms of its innovative locomotive fleet, but it was ambitious in terms of its architecture. And this, I think, is central to understanding how it moved the railway story forward. The Liverpool and Manchester cost £600,000 to build. I'm sure we could all work out with the aid of some helpful computer gizmo just how much that is in modern day terms, but it was a very great deal of money indeed. There had only been a few engineering projects in Britain that had been more costly than that. But Liverpool was an immensely wealthy city. It had grown rich on the cotton trade. It had grown rich on the trade in enslaved Africans. It has a murky history in that respect. And I think it was looking to modernize its offer. Now, the chimneys, I'd like you to bear in mind those two chimneys. These are the chimneys that exhausted the steam from the fixed engines, which were located just behind the artist. Fixed engine traction was nothing new on railways either, nor, in all honesty, where the other interesting architectural features along the railway. Look, for instance, at the next slide, which shows one of the bridges over the railway. I rather like this because it shows how the railway coexisted with the very well-developed road transport industry of the time, but it shows a skew arch bridge. These, again, were comparatively new, but they hadn't been around for very long. The architecture of the railway was impressive and it was well executed. The civil engineering of the railway was very well thought through, as well as the mechanical engineering. The civil engineering included some major challenges. The tunnel under Liverpool was a very difficult job indeed, but the most famous engineering challenge that the railway overcame was crossing Chat Moss, which is shown on my next slide. This was an extensive area of very boggy country between the two cities of Liverpool and Manchester. This was the first intercity railway. We have to remember railways had already been built to connect collieries with navigable water. The Stockton and Darlington is one such example. Railways had already been built to connect market towns with each other. But the Liverpool and Manchester was the first to connect two big trading cities. And in between them lay Chat Moss, this extensive boggy area, which the railway overcame by methods which I think they tried to pass off as innovative, but in fact were already fairly well established. The road engineer Thomas Telford had similar problems crossing boggy ground, and he had overcome it by the same means of dumping fascines into the bog that were practiced at Chat Moss. Now, what is also interesting about this particular slide is that it's a preliminary sketch for some of the artistic impressions of the railway that were commissioned right from the start. The Liverpool and Manchester's directors had a long commercial experience, and they knew that public presentation was important. This not only meant an innovative locomotive design, it not only meant innovative architecture, it meant publicity. And one of these sketches was later worked up into a painting, which shows, I think, the sheer force of the railway imposing itself on the landscape. Liverpool had a lot of money to invest, and it wanted people to understand that this wasn't the only railway which would yield a good dividend. Liverpool investors over the next few years were to be investing in a great number of railways, including the London to Bristol, the future Great Western Railway. So the terrain was a challenging one, but it was overcome. What about persuading people that passenger transport was going to be acceptable on a railway such as this? Well, my next slide shows the station at Crown Street in Liverpool. And again, I think there's something of the reasonably well established and something of the modern here. This was not the first railway station, but points at which people on, say, the Stockton and Darlington joined or left trains were much humbler than this. They were a local pub. If a train stopped by the pub, that's where you got on and off. Same is true of some other early passenger carrying railways. Where I think the Liverpool and Manchester learnt about the importance of architectural statement in building a station such as this was from the canal network that had seen so much investment over the previous 50, 40 years, and canals had been building some very large and impressive hotels, places where you could book a ticket, but where you could also stay, and not just in England, but in Ireland as well. So again, it's a matter of combining a number of reasonably well established, but still relatively novel aspects into creating a new transport system. So people could arrive in their coaches at Crown Street Station or Liverpool Street in Manchester, and they could be ushered onto a train. It was impressive, but it was not intimidating. Now, the most extraordinary architectural concoction, it seems to me, on the railway is in my next slide, and that is the Moorish Arch. This was drawn from more or less the same standpoint as the tunnel I showed you a little while ago, but turned through 180 degrees. And it was in the towers either side of the Moorish Arch that the fixed engines were located. Architecturally, it seems to me the railway is quite eclectic, and that's very much the fashion of the times in Britain. It was an imperial power. People were fascinated by other cultures and the way that they could be absorbed into the British view of things. But if we now turn our minds back through 180 degrees, let me show you something else that isn't on a railway at all. This is the next slide. There we go. Recall those two chimneys and consider these two columns. These were the coat of arms of the Emperor Charles V in the 16th century, where they symbolized European conquest of other countries, of other lands. It symbolized imperial authority, but they are also the symbols of the columns of Hercules on either sides of the Strait of Gibraltar, from which Europeans went out to the Americas. Now, as a symbol of imperial dominion in the 16th century, it became a symbol of intellectual conquest in the 17th. And my next slide shows an adaptation of this symbol by the philosopher Francis Bacon. So Francis Bacon, who was Lord Chancellor of England, adapted this symbol to indicate the role of, if you like, intellectual discovery, not conquest of further lands necessarily, but the role of intellect, the ship of intellect, setting forth between the columns of known intellect, of the world of Aristotle, basically. And although this dates from the 17th century, so 200 years before the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester, the early 19th century in England was seeing a revival of Baconian learning, of empirical scientific learning. And this was something that the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, as they consciously evoked the Baconian imagery. The publicity material said these chimneys of these steam engines are our columns of Hercules. This is Liverpool's role in driving forward intellectual discovery and commercial expansion. Well, let's move on, because oh yes, sorry, I should have mentioned, it doesn't end with the Liverpool and Manchester. The same device was used at the end of the 1830s in 1838 on the London and Birmingham Railway, where the steep section out of Euston Station came to be wound for the first few years by fixed steam engines. The loco shed was located just beyond the two chimneys at Camden, and locomotives hauled the trains from there onwards to Birmingham. But you can see that this was clearly a symbol that mattered a very great deal to these early railway promoters, and they considered this a very important point to make, that the railway was part of a completely new world, or at least railway engineering on this scale. Now, I've mentioned mechanical engineering, I've mentioned architecture, but ultimately, it seems to me, and this is something I've also learned in my involvement with railways are about people. If the boiler in your locomotive needs repairing, well, okay, you can repair it. At least if you have the people behind you. If your passenger numbers aren't as good as you'd hoped, well, if you can persuade people to come, if you can persuade people that this is a place you should visit, then you can build them up. And this, it seems to me as well, is something that the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester grasped from the start. Let's have a look at some of the people who were invited to the opening day in September 1830. Well, perhaps the most famous of them was a young woman who was, I think, still in her teens at the time, Frances Kemble, an actress, one of the leading Shakespearean actresses at the time, and very much a celebrity in the modern sense. Now, many of you may recall that she had a ride on one of the locomotives with George Stephenson before the railway was opened, and wrote an absolutely delightful description of it. So she was invited back. George Stephenson, I've no doubt, absolutely enjoyed sharing the footplate with a charming, very beautiful, and very intelligent young woman, and said she must come back for the official opening. So Fanny Kemble was very much a celebrity, as we would understand the term now. What about some of the other guests? We don't have a definitive list, but we do know that they were drawn very much from the elite of not just British, but European nobility at the time. This gentleman is Prince Paul Esterházy, an Austro-Hungarian nobleman, a man so rich that when he came to stay at Holkham Hall on his visit to the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, Lord Holkham told him that he owned 2,000 sheep. And Prince Esterházy replied, "I own 2,000 shepherds and a lot more sheep." He was a very considerable individual indeed. And it's remarkable, isn't it, that people came from all over Europe to see the opening of this system. Well, if Esterházy was rich, one of the other guests, I think, was probably the richest man in the world at the time, and this is him. And this is Prince Paul Demidov, owner of ironworks in the Ural Mountains. His great something grandfather had been given, who was a blacksmith, had been given the privilege of opening up the ironworks in the Urals by Peter the Great, and the family had gone on from strength to strength. As a boy of 14, he had taken part in the Battle of Borodino, and as the owner of these ironworks in the Ural Mountains, he was determined to see that what the latest technology could offer. And when he returned to Russia, he did something quite remarkable. He sent over two of his serfs no, I stand corrected. He sent over one of his serfs, a young man whose father, also a serf, also one of the managerial serfs in Demidov's empire, his industrial empire, had already gone to England to see the locomotives on the Middleton Railway. Demidov now sent this man's son over, who couldn't speak a word of English. Nobody knew who he was, but somehow or other he managed to find out how the locomotives worked, drew sketches and plans, and on his return to Russia with Demidov's backing, he and his father built the first two locomotives in the Russian Empire, which were basically copies of the locomotives that were then operating on the Liverpool and Manchester, not the rocket, but the next generation, which were introduced about 1830, 1831. So Demidov was there as a wealthy ironmaster, very wealthy ironmaster. Another person we know who visited the railway on its opening day was Count Alfred Potocki, member of a very distinguished Polish family, sympathetic to improvement and to political change, if you like, a modernizer. We have to remember that 1830 was a year of revolution in France. The post-Napoleonic settlement of 1815, the Congress of Vienna, was certainly taking a while to settle down, and nobody really knew what direction Europe, continental Europe, and Britain should be going, whether the old elites should remain in place, whether they themselves should be the people who are ushering in change, or whether newer social forces would be ensuring the direction of the various countries of Europe. Potocki was a modernizer. He wanted to see what this new system could offer for his country. Another modernizer is this unfortunate gentleman. You can see here that he's being shot by a firing squad. This was some years after his visit to the Liverpool and Manchester, I hasten to assure people. But he is Prince Lajos Batiani. I hope I've pronounced that correctly. A Hungarian nobleman who became Prime Minister of Hungary during the revolutions of 1848 and was caught out by the political changes of the period, and he was accused of treason and was executed in 1849. But I think you get the picture that these are people who are, first of all, they're very important, they're very influential, but they're also people who are anxious to take their own countries in a new and modern direction, and they feel that the railway is one way in which this might happen. At the very least, they felt they needed to know what it was about and the possibilities that it offered. Now, if these people were in the main progressives, the same cannot be said of this gentleman. This is the Duke of Wellington. Now, the Duke of Wellington, along with Marshal Blucher, perhaps more than anybody, had assured the world that the reign of the Corsican tyrant would not last. Napoleon Bonaparte was defeated by the Duke at Waterloo in 1815, and this very, very capable military commander had a second life as a perhaps less than successful politician of a very conservative hue. On the other hand, he was the Prime Minister. He was a very important and a very popular figure. And I feel that one of the reasons behind the decision to invite him was that he would, if you like, give a conservative's blessing to what was essentially a very progressive development. The Duke turned up for the opening in his black cloak and his military uniform. He was greeted by a band playing Handel's See the Conquering Hero Comes. Now, that had been played at all sorts of openings of canals and civic events. Nothing on the scale of the Liverpool and Manchester, it must be said, but increasingly, of course, when that particular piece of music was played at railway openings, people came to understand that the conquering hero was not necessarily the guest of honor. The conquering hero was, in fact, the locomotive. Now, the Duke was indirectly responsible for the cataclysm which completely ruined the day. It would have been a major development in British and world history, even if it hadn't been responsible for the death of a cabinet minister, one of the Duke's allies, William Huskisson, who had been president of the Board of Trade. And I dare say all of you know the story that when Huskisson saw the Duke in his carriage, he decided that this would be an opportune moment to cross the tracks and to shake the Duke's hand and repair a relationship, a political relationship that had become damaged. And to this end, Huskisson mounted the running board of the Duke's carriage, panicked when he saw a locomotive being driven on the adjacent track, fell over, and the locomotive ran diagonally across his leg. It didn't sever his leg. Um, Huskisson was in bad health. He was 60 years old. He had been advised by his doctor not to attend the opening day, but he was a very dutiful man. He felt that he owed it to his Liverpool constituents to do so. And again, as I'm sure you know, he was taken by train to a surgery where a doctor tried to comfort or make his last hours as comfortable as possible. The opening day train continued to Manchester, and again, things didn't work out well there. Liverpool had invested most of the money that went into the railway. Manchester hadn't. The trading town, the port town, had put the money in. The manufacturing town hadn't. I don't quite know why. There's certainly plenty of money there, and it would benefit Manchester economically. But when the trains, there were several opening day trains, got to Manchester, first of all, the weather had turned. News that Huskisson was gravely ill and was unlikely to survive had got around. And there were also threats of an attack on the railway from the people of Manchester. They were obviously nowhere near as enamoured of it. There were Republican tricolours hung from the bridges. There was a story that men from the nearby town of Oldham were coming to attack the railway. When the trains arrived in Manchester, it was decided that the ceremonial dinner, which was to take place at Liverpool, couldn't go ahead. And after much discussion, all the trains were joined together, and taken one very, very long train back to Liverpool, and everybody dispersed. So it was a very sorry end indeed to an opening day, and it can have done the cause of the railways very little good indeed. It is noticeable how quite a few opening days do in fact meet with an accident because staff don't know what they're supposed to be doing necessarily. Passengers don't know how to conduct themselves when a steam locomotive and a train is in question. I can think of several other examples. But I'll just make the point, perhaps, that the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester had grasped some very important details. They had understood the importance of publicity at the very highest level, and not just politicos, not just clergy, but also people in the public eye. That was going to be necessary if this new form of technology was to take root. They'd understood that it had to look good, and the two stations and the Moorish Arch, the columns and the tunnel were all part of the architectural ambition, which bit by bit becomes part of the railway scene. And to my mind, the most magnificent railway station in the world is undoubtedly the Bombay terminal. It can trace its ancestry to what was built at Liverpool and Manchester. I think it is also interesting to note, and this takes us a little bit away from engineering, but the political dimension to railway building, I think, is important. The Duke of Wellington was a conservative, but he was certainly prepared to consider change when it was necessary. Britain as a whole, by the late 1820s, the early 1830s, was going through one of its periodic bouts of I don't know what we'd call it, social disagreement, and perhaps every country does this most of the time. But was Britain going to be run by its aristocracy? Was it going to be ruled by commercial elites? And the answer was obviously that the commercial elite would be increasingly important. That universal suffrage was not in prospect, but an important political concession that had been made the previous year was in a Protestant Christian country to allow Catholics to vote. So the old England and the old Britain were changing. The grotesque irony, it seems to me, of the day that it should be the political representative of the commercial interest, William Huskisson, should have been the victim of the rocket, driven, I might add, by a very distinguished engineer in his own right, Joseph Locke. So,
Hi, David.
as
Sorry to
yep,
interrupt you here. We have just 10 more minutes, a small
10
time
more
check.
minutes, fine. Yeah, that's great. Well, I will be drawing my remarks to a close anyway now because I would like to leave as much opportunity possible for any discussion to take place. So I think what I'd like to do by way of conclusion is to say that here we see all the factors that make railway building possible in a way that hadn't been seen before. Just as civil and mechanical engineering had reached a stage of maturity where it is possible to build these long double-track city-to-city railways, we're also seeing acceptance of this new technology at the highest political level, not just in its own country, but across Europe. I should perhaps have mentioned there was an American representative there, the American consul in Liverpool, and also at a very popular level that people were beginning to see what this technology might mean. And they were also beginning to see how it might be applicable outside the immediate circumstances of Liverpool and Manchester. So there, ladies and gentlemen, you have my take on the opening day of the Liverpool and Manchester. I would like to thank you all for your very kind attention. I would particularly like to thank Manikandan for his excellent organisation, for helping me, a person whose understanding of technology is rather restricted to the steam era. I'm not a digital person particularly, but I hope what I have said has been of interest to you from a British perspective, but to an Indian audience. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gwyn. It was such a very fact-based and detailed presentation. I was just jotting down some notes as you were giving us multitude of facts. I think the theme of this year's conference was tale of iconic trains, the journey, the railway journey on iconic trains. But I think what you have done for us is that you have taken us on a train journey, a primordial train journey, as it would have been in the 1830s. And you made us actually put ourselves in the shoes of one of the earliest travelers on the first mechanically hauled line. So I think this was the perfect example of a primordial train journey. So thank you so much for giving us such a fact loaded presentation. So we do have some questions here. So Apurva Bahadur, he is one of the active members of a society. He has asked, what was the length of the cable hauled section of this railway?
I think the answer to that is about half a mile. It was certainly in that region. Now, the gradient through the tunnel was, it no longer has rails, it still exists, was fairly steep, and there was no option but to use cable haulage. Now, I can give a detailed answer if anybody wants to contact me by email. And Manny, you're very welcome to pass on my email address to anybody who wants to discuss any of these issues. What's interesting as well, though, is that one of the arguments, of course, that had been going on the year before the opening of the railway was whether the whole thing should be hauled by stationary engines, and whether locomotives were in fact capable of doing the job. One has to remember that the pre-rocket locomotives were all rather small, very slow, lumbering colliery engines. And even after the Rainhill trials in 1829, there were still some who felt that rope haulage would be needed, and possibly not on the entire railway, but on one or two sections where the gradient was fairly steep. I think one other question while we're on the stationary engines is why did the engines exhaust at such a distance away? And I think there are two answers there. Now, I am no engineer, but I understand that the length of the exhaust conduit affects steaming. That is why so many early locomotives had very tall chimneys indeed. And the other answer is, of course, that they wanted to create these columns of Hercules because, that was part of the story they were telling.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Quinn, for that. So I have some questions for you based on your presentation. So you are talking about the columns of Hercules and how it represented either imperial ambitions or knowledge transfer or commercial interests.
Yeah.
So what I could see based on my reading is that, for example, when the first German railway line opened, the first steam locomotive which the Germans had was called the Der Adler, and then which means the eagle, and then that also had a very long chimney. Is this because of this reason, or was it something else?
Well, I think the fact that the locomotive is called Der Adler, the eagle, it's meant to indicate soaring ambition. This was something completely new in the context of Germany. I might add, of course, the locomotive itself came from England, and so did its driver. Driver's name was Thomas Wilson, and he came from Northumbria, the coal mining areas in the northeast of England, the birthplace of the
Mhm.
English railway, certainly. And the Nuremberg to Firth railway, I think, is a very interesting one. If you look online, you can see an excellent model of it in, I think, one of the Nuremberg museums. Again, it's nothing like the scale of the Liverpool and Manchester, but you can see that it's trying to do the same sort of thing. It's trying to provide an impressive, but also ultimately reassuring way of getting people to travel by train. That there had been, oh, there was indeed a canal project going on at the same time, and the Nuremberg to Firth was, in a sense, a test track, literally, for this new form of transport. Interestingly, as well, I don't think they used the locomotive very much. I don't think Der Adler was used a great deal because all the coal had to come from Saxony by horse and cart. And that was a costly business. So I think it probably used horses most of the time.
Thank you. And you did walk us through the dignitaries who were present at the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester. So the initial part of it were people on the commercial side and progressives, as you call them. And you did have to balance them. You did have conservatives like the Duke of Wellington. So the question that I have is, do you feel that the railway hastened the fall of monarchies and old social structure, or was it something else?
That is a very, very interesting question, and I think that's going to take several books and several authors to decide. Right, let me give you some very preliminary thoughts there, and you're welcome to disagree. This is off the top of my head. Um, I think the railway generally forced modernization. It placed power in the hands of very wealthy business people, in certainly in Britain, certainly in the United States of America in the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century. I would also say that people who were cautious about railways, like Tsar Nicholas I of Russia and Metternich in Vienna, actually had good reason to be careful because they understood that it was a modernizing force, and modernizing forces weren't necessarily what they wanted. On the other hand, Tsar Nicholas was an engineer, and if he was distrustful of railways, then he was also fascinated by them. Metternich certainly wasn't. So yeah, the railway modernizes. Now I'm really I don't know whether I know enough to be able to say this, but I've been very interested in the way that Gandhi and Nehru, and before both of them, Al-Afghani, the Muslim scholar Al-Afghani, saw the railway as essentially a means by which Europeans gain control of other countries in Asia and elsewhere. And I think I'd be right in saying that Nehru explicitly said that, the railways were not a problem, far from it, but that what railways did do was align Indian trade to external markets. And it seems to me that this is something that the Liverpool and Manchester exemplifies, because by no means all the cotton had come from India, but an awful lot of it had. So I don't know. I'm speaking a bit out of my comfort zone here, but any
Mm.
comments you may have would be very welcome.
I don't know. I mean, I tend to agree with your points. I think it was all about how the prevailing social structures or the government systems, whether it's a monarchy or republic, use the modernizing force. So if they resisted it too much, I think it led to their downfall. Or if it was used for exploitation, it led to their downfall, I guess. But those who were able to manage it well, they were able to survive, bringing in the additional importance for the commercial interests, of course. I mean, I agree with you. I agree with
Yeah,
whatever you
okay.
said. Okay. An interesting, yeah, we still have some time. So, an interesting analogy, if you may call it. You said that for the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester, they had invited an actress, a steel baron from Russia, and so on. Don't you think this is something continuing even to the current day? I mean, if you do have something to open, some significant project to open, we call movie stars, I mean, even in India, people do call actors and actresses to open the stuff. And then I think the steel magnates from whatever country they do own some of your football clubs or something like that, isn't it? So it's something that.
That's a very interesting observation. I think, yes, this is one of the ways in which we're not just seeing technical modernity, but we're seeing commercial modernity arriving on the scene. Now, actors and actresses, yes, it's interesting that in Britain they were socially quite accepted. An actress could expect to be invited around to dinner parties, concerts, and balls, especially, of course, if they were young, good-looking, and charming, as Frances Kemble obviously was. But there'd been earlier English actresses who'd experienced the same sort of social success and admiration for their skills. So yeah, I mean, if she were a movie star now, she would doubtless get invited to the opening of something or other quite important. The point about sports personalities is interesting because 1830 is before the British obsession with football, or even cricket. And the most popular sports that everybody shared, well, many people shared in Britain at the time, were cockfighting and boxing. But the boxing superstars were, I think, regarded as basically, professional thugs at the time. They were not socially acceptable in the way that Fanny Kemble would have been, and so an invitation was not likely to be forthcoming to any of them. One thing that is very interesting about the guest list, we don't know how the guest list was put together, but there was only one bishop. That was the bishop of the diocese within which Liverpool is situated. Now, at one time, of course, the clergy, senior clergy, would have been invited to something like that automatically. So the diocesan bishop arrives. Nobody makes much of a fuss of him. His opinions aren't sought. He doesn't say anything about it. But compare that with the way that in continental Europe, in the 1840s and 1850s, the Catholic Church is initially very dubious about the railway. And then at some stage, it clearly decides, the Vatican clearly decides, well, these are going to happen. So let's literally give it our blessing. So you have the Duke of Wellington coming to Liverpool to give, if you like, a conservative's blessing to the railway. By the next decades, a railway in a Catholic country would normally be opened by the local dignitaries, who would include, at the very least, the bishop. And the Catholic Church devised ceremonies specifically for the opening of railway lines and telegraph stations. So if you want to know the Latin for steam locomotive, I'm afraid you need to look at some of these sources, but that is what happened. So conservative elites certainly learned to live with the railway quite happily.
An interesting point is that one of the first railway lines in India, especially in the southern parts of India, from a place called Raipuram near Chennai, which was previously called Madras, that railway station and that line, when it was opened from Raipuram to Valaja Road, it was the British had invited the church priests to open the line. It is actually depicted in a painting, so I was just reminded of it when you were talking about this. Okay,
I'd be very interested
so
to see the painting.
yes, I'll just share it with you when
Thank you.
I'll just go through my computer or any other document where I have it, and then I'll share it with you as soon as I catch hold
Thank you.
of it. Okay, I think we do have some comments. Mr. Singh has mentioned that the first locomotive that ran in India was actually named after a singer, Jenny Lind. It was named, it seems. So that's okay.
Well, she was far and away the most popular celebrity of her day. Beautiful voice. She was a Danish woman, of course, not an English woman. But again, I think giving locomotives the name of a beautiful woman with a very sweet voice was probably an astute public relations move as well.
Of course, later the same
Okay.
locomotive was renamed Thompson after the Lieutenant Governor of the Northwest Province. But initially, the loco was named after Jenny Lind.
Okay. I just have one question before. I know we just have 3 more minutes, but the last question I have is, you were talking about publicity, and on the opening of Liverpool and Manchester, William Huskisson was actually killed by a train coming on the other side. So it was a massive it should have been a massive public relations disaster. That's true. He was a representative of the people, you said, not of the conservative elite or the people at the higher
Not to the
echelons of
same
the society.
extent, no. He
Okay.
was no reformer, but he was not like the Duke.
Okay. But how did the railways become so popular despite that mishap, which happened on the first day?
Oh, such a good question. Well, perhaps Huskisson's death did not help the cause. It's interesting that within a couple of years, a book is published in German extolling the railway that is called, in translation, A Word in Time for a Good Cause. And what it says is, okay, Huskisson may have been killed, great shame, but it's still a very good idea. And I think people recognized it for the transformative technology it was clearly going to be.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gwynn. I don't know the British version of Robert Langdon, the symbologist, but I think you had very clearly shown us the various railway symbols along the way, apart from taking us on a time travel. I do hope that we can stay in touch and you can do many more of these events. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, Manikandan.